last session of the year, which maybe some of you are celebrating. Maybe some of you are going to be very sad about that. Who knows? But thanks very much for coming to classes and any interaction that you provided through these. I've enjoyed sharing Back to Roots with you guys, and I wish you all well if any of you have to leave midway through this session. And as with all of my sessions, open invite. If you don't want to be here, then sign the register and pop off. No judgment passed from myself. But whichever way you go after this, I wish you all well. And it's been an interesting year. But I hope you've got something from the sessions that I've tried to share with you guys. We're going to finish off by continuing to work through contemporary exercise prescription, which I started with you guys last time. And mainly the things that we're going to be looking at is that performer-environment interaction, seeing it as an entwined entity. And I've created a little bit of footage from a chap that I'm working with at the moment, to just give some examples, cases that I know that they're very helpful for learning, for you to be able to see my clinical reasoning and how I have brought in these ecological dynamic concepts working as a chiropractor, because of course you guys will have a large scope around how you want to be able to operate whichever way you go after this. So my goal with this contemporary evidence-based approach here is that doesn't really matter if you're a chiropractor, physio. This is just some of what the literature is directing us towards. And that Vaz paper, that Vaz et al. 27 paper, moving towards an ecological practice, I think is a beautiful paper. It's a really challenging paper, so don't go reading that if you're looking for easy solutions. Interesting ones though, which I want to share with you here, because it builds along this idea around representative design. So how close does your rehabilitation represent what the end goal is? And that's going to be important. It's going to be context specific, and we have some limitations or some constraints around that by being in a gym or being in a clinic. But I think what the last 18 months with the pandemic has shown is that with telehealth and various means that we can get out of that, and we can be drawing upon ecological concepts to be able to bring our rehab into the 21st century. Perception action coupling was being able to see if we can create tasks or environments where an action might take place that puts the person in charge, and seeing behavior as this entwined, as this image I've taken here from the Vaz paper, the environment, the individual over time as entwined. And you're not going to be, as much as we would try to be able to unravel that, if we take the starling out of the murmuration, it's going to behave differently. So let's see if we maybe start in a non-representative place, in a clinic or in a gym. How do we then return someone? That's what our sensitive to robust idea is, seeing as a continuum or as a spectrum to be able to return people to. So I think it's one thing to talk about these things. I think it's another one to see it. And for me, it's a very interesting way to work. You know, I lose interest in things quite quickly. So keeping things varied and keeping things that hold my attention is one of the beautiful things about being an entrepreneur, about being in charge of your own practice, and about doing things and dynamically moving. This is a gentleman who came to me. We've been working together for about 6 weeks, and he's had about a year of back pain. And the initial injury was doing downhill cycling, which I don't know too much about, never done it. So part of the process has been him teaching me about that. And since the mechanism of injury, he has had back pain. That has been over a year. So like all of us, who has his own profile of psychosocial factors, runs his own business, and various things that we can't talk about, but that's the nature of the A, B, C, D, E, F, W that you guys should be familiar with in how you tease out some of these things that could be a factor. Now, his goal was to be able to return pain-free, again, like a lot of the patients who will see you. But then when we teased out the things that are meaningful to him, the things that he can do beyond being pain-free, you know, they were to be able to lift in the gym again without being worried about setting off his back pain. So lifting things up causes him a problem, and he wants to get back cycling, but is convinced that that is not something he's able to do, because he also went and got an MRI scan. And for all the reasons that we say, the people, the over scanning and over imaging leads to worse outcomes. This was another example of that, because he went and had an MRI scan, which then confirmed that he had a pars fracture. So then we have all the levels of unraveling, and me having to weigh up with my assessment whether his symptoms were driven by a spondylolisthesis or a pars defect, which is characteristically an extension-based pattern. There's different types like isthmic, congenital, and traumatic, things that could be as a factor, but primarily that is going to be an extension-based provocation. People who have a background in gymnastics, in weightlifting, and from a young age. People don't tend to be born with it, but then it can have a number of reasons that would lead to why someone might have a pars defect. But his symptom provocation was apparently context specific, it was flexion based, and that took some time to be able to unravel that with him, to get him past the idea that his pars defect, that singular one cause, was the cause of his back pain. Then the goal was to be able to get him comfortable with hurtbot not being equal to harm, not being one and the same, that we could dial his nervous system up and down. He wasn't particularly keen on the idea of learning, so we had to make it as unofficial as possible and as conversational as possible. But I wanted to make sure that he had an implicit expression of different things can set off his alarm system, not just tissue damage. So I would use little games like, I want him to be able to recall 5 things that can set off the alarm system, tissue damage being one, meeting him where he's at with that. Temperature changes being another one, example of how people, you know, we went through the pain education as to how we use that, but temperature changes can set off the alarm system because it's got different receptors in the nerves. Blood flow, sit still too long, get that wriggle, and that is going to be a driver behind aches and pains. If I stay in a car too long at the moment, my knees are sensitive as fuck, so I have to get really wriggly and straighten my legs, because purely being in a flex knee position is a problem. So blood flow is an example that I like to pick people to be able to get at, to be able to draw out of it, because it again insinuates that changing what they're doing on movement can be really helpful. Immune system, so being run down, having a bit of an illness, talking about cold and flu, people get aches and pains, that again isn't tissue damage based, and stress, runs his own business. So being able to have that there's different things, there's a multifaceted approach. This is what we worked on for a period of weeks, whilst at the same time getting him onto a linear program with barbell medicine. Barbell medicine have templates, which any of you have access to use. Those guys are absolutely rock solid and well versed in pain literature and a person-centered biopsychosocial approach married up with lifting. So they've got a back pain program that has a bit of a presentation that goes with it. It's 10 slides just talking about the prevalence of back pain, the good prognosis, the biopsychosocial perspective, tissue damage and harm. So again, gave him that to be able to support the process, and got him going with deadlifts, squats, things that using this spreadsheets show the numbers over the course of 4 weeks. And there was a real job to be able to say, right, you know, nothing you're going to show me in the gym here now is going to impress me. What is going to impress me is that you can show me these numbers over the next 4 weeks so we can see the trend. And that was hard work, but once we got 2-3 weeks in, it builds a graph that shows the function going up. And that is so powerful for him to be able to see, oh yeah, my function is going up, my load that my back is tolerating is going up, my pains maybe staying the same, or it's even getting a little bit better, getting that dissociation to the point where I want to then be able to get him into the context where we want his end goal and where he wants to be able to violate his previous experience. So then we went and met on the Elan Valley, which is a beautiful landscape up here in mid Wales. If you haven't been and had a wander around here, then I suggest you do it, especially if you're from abroad and you haven't done that before you go. It's a load of dams that basically supply the water to the Midlands in England. Very beautiful scenery, but it's very well known for some of the downhill cycling. So we went and met there, and we walked the track, graded exposure, and I got him to teach me about cycling, so shared decision making, and things that the time frames that he would normally go down there in, for me to be able to offer some constraints around reining the intensity back. And then this was the second session that is an application of this idea of ecological dynamics. So you have the clinical reason and the context behind what this process is about. Here we have Harry. We're up in the Elan Valley. Harry has had a history of back pain and even went and got a scan, got confirmation of a pars defect. So we've been grading exposure to get him back downhill biking. This is the second time we've come to the track. We've put a time cap on how fast he can go, because this is one of his most provocative activities, and as you can tell, high loading on landing these jumps, but great exposure to the context. Nice. How'd that feel? That looked really nice on there, mate. Quite an impact coming around there as well. Just give us a little summary from your perspective about what we're doing here today.
Basically just getting into it slowly again. Letting yourself, let your mind, your body.
What's the word we've been using? Grading exposure.
Grading exposure, getting yourself comfortable, doing it at like a low impact, low speed.
So what we worked on in terms of understanding for what pain is and what pain isn't up to this point. Tissue damage.
Tissue damage, yeah, is very different to, well, pain and tissue damage aren't linked.
So it's something, the goal of us ending this session today as a second session has been all about what? Getting down?
Getting down without minimal pain.
Minimal pain
Minimal
and
impact.
violating the exposure,
Yeah.
Violating the experience. So that's awesome. We're going to be coming back up here again. We put a time cap on this run, which Harry says you could normally do in
Just about a minute, just over a minute.
about a minute. So we put a time cap today on about 2 minutes from top to bottom, but I think we went a bit quicker than that.
Yeah.
So we will be coming back here and we will be releasing the constraints on his time as we build up your confidence coming back through downhill run. Great stuff. So I'm not going to ask for you guys to think about how you could apply these, as in the last group it was like a tumbleweed. All I am going to suggest is that if you're sat there, just have a little think about how you might be able to apply these concepts of seeing the person and the environment as an entwined entity. If you work in a clinic, is there ways that you're able to utilize telehealth, be able to get into the environment and start bridging that gap to be able to apply some of these concepts. Hopefully seeing as an example there is giving a couple of people some some food for thought at least. But we shall move on. Where do we get to? Up to here. Daniel. Yeah, that's as I described at the start there, basically what he described as landing one of those jumps was when he felt a clear jolt in his back over a year ago that he attributes to the onset of his back pain. So I had him, I had his description to go by, same as any of you guys will have with a person when you're in clinic there. And I sort of imagined how that might look to be able to get a picture of it. Then when I got him to teach me a bit about downhill biking, so I got him to show me some stuff on YouTube around what the sort of jumps and things that he would do. It was a higher jump than that. But having just gone and spent a little bit of time with him, you know, very, very crazy sport, downhill cycling. It is, I think, less about fitness, more about adrenaline. I'm maybe missing a little bit there, because quite often with the downhill, there's tracks where you just get a lift back to the top, so you don't even ride up. You just go kamikaze all the way down. So it's a massive, you know, there's a massive inherent risk of injury with doing that. So that's something we had to talk about and be able to say, you know, I draw on examples for myself. You know, I can talk from experience around playing rugby. You know, I know going into play rugby that there's a risk that I get injured, and I've had some very serious injuries. But sometimes the risk of injury is worth it. Other times you make a call that it's not. And for him, we talked about that, and he wanted to be able to get back to being able to cycle. So we graded it, and I sold him a program which is 12 weeks. We're about halfway through it. So the plan is in 2 weeks that we're going to go back there, and we're going to release the constraints, and we're going to get it go a little bit faster. But the point being is that he's now comfortable that he could experience back pain, he could experience injury, but the meaning of it is different to it being about a pars defect. That is been one of the really, really big challenges there with him. So that little jump that I shared there was our first attempt at getting him to experience that type of movement and loading, and you know, I hoped for him to not have a flare up, and he didn't. But if he did have one, we were able to explain it. So yeah, that's a little bit of the thinking process around that. So that's also, this ties back into that idea of representative design. So nothing I'm going to do in clinic is going to, you know, I could get him on a bike in a gym. I'm not going to be able to replicate him being in that situation any better way than him being in that situation. That's a little bit rehab, you know, if you work with athletes, you're grading people towards being back on the field. So I just posed the question to you guys, you know, can you bring that into clinical rehabilitation of aches and pains? It's almost, I guess, a little bit like bridging and bringing in components of physiotherapy, components of occupational therapy, but blurring the boundaries between them all to just be a person-centered healthcare professional. So that's really, really my challenge to some of you. Some people think that's not chiropractic, and that's fine. But here's another thing that I want to be able to share with you, which is the myth of proprioceptive training, because you'll see a lot of people who will go physio, and I guarantee there's 16 in this group, but at least half of you will have sprained your ankle to some extent in your lifetime, and you'll have probably had some wobble board or stability rehab that is given in the hope of building up your proprioception or joint position sense to be able to prevent you injuring your ankle. And again, if we look at the representative design of when ankles get injured, they go from neutral to an injurious amount of inversion in under 50 milliseconds. So that's when you run in and you tread on a little rock or you tread on a curb, and it happens in a very short period of time. And in closed loop feedback strategies, so what that means is that you are in control of the perturbation. So you are on a wobble board here or on a half foam roller, and you've got an unstable surface, but the fact that you're in control of it means that the time that it takes you to experience inversion and then come back to neutral is greater than 100 milliseconds. That's what this Kim research found, which again, from a representative design perspective, is that time frame over 100 milliseconds representative of the time frame that injurious inversion happens when running. So it throws a question mark over using these types of rehabilitation for preventing ankle sprains or to rebuild proprioception in the knee. And what they then did was looked at this concept of dual task training, where they do a balance task and then they also give the participants so a balance task could be standing on a wobble board like that, it could be walking across a beam, it could be any balance task, and then they give them a secondary task on top of that. That could be something like multiplication, or it could be a spelling, or it could be to be able to catch an object, basically a secondary task that has to hold your attention. And what they found over a period of training, so either just doing the balance training or doing balance training plus a secondary task laid on top, those who had the secondary task laid on top did superior in a novel task in a follow-up period after the training of a month had finished. And also on top of that was the commands that the researchers gave the person. So even in the dual task training, if the participants were told sometimes, or on every task they were told, even though it's dual task, so dual task would be, so you're balancing, but then you're also going to count down in sevens. Start at 105, count down in sevens. And they were told, focus on the balance in this one, or focus on the counting task, or it was varied what they were going to focus on. Those where it was varied did superior on a follow-up task as well. And that's been attributed to the idea that when you can take the conscious processing out of balance, what happens is it's driven to more subconscious processes of self-organization that is faster. And that's where, in the process of doing that, we build up motor experience or build up motor engrams that are more representative of the time frame of when injurious ankle inversion happens. So that's the idea of dual task training, doing a balance task and then layering other things on top of it to drive the balance subconscious. So I want you guys to be able to experience that. I prefer teaching experientially, and that's when I'm working with clients or working with healthcare professionals alike. So we're going to have a go at applying this, okay? Again, it's open invite, so you don't have to do any of this, but I'm going to give us a 2-minute period where what you're going to do is you're going to do 50 single leg hops. You're going to do 50 single leg hops, and then you're going to stop on that same leg, and you're going to close your eyes and you're going to try and balance for 60 seconds. And I want you to see how many times you have to touch the floor with your non-balancing leg. Okay, so there's a bit of a pre-fatiguing element. I'll use this as a protocol in ankle and knee rehabilitation, but you're going to have a go at 50 single leg bounces, and then I have a stopwatch on my hand the whole time. You can use your phone as a stopwatch to start and stop if you want to. And I want to see how many times you have to touch the floor in your 60-second set with your eyes closed. Okay. Open invite, you don't have to do it, but if you do, pop it into the chat afterwards, and we're going to do a secondary task on top of that afterwards, okay? So your 2-minute set starts now to be able to see how you get on My girlfriend's doing it in front of me, so at least I can see someone doing it. So we're about a minute in now. People should be into their 60-second set. Oh, nice.
One.
We've done that with you before.
No.
So that's level 1. So if people can get through that. There.
That's on my good leg, my stronger leg.
If people can get through that, then we make the task more challenging. But if you had a period of ankle injury or pain, you find that very challenging. That's good, doing that in one touch. Shin burning.
Yeah.
So that's 2.5 minutes. Should be some feedback coming back in. Daniel's given me 10. 10, is that 10 seconds, Daniel, or 10 floor touches? What did you, 10 floor touches? Nice. Okay, cool. Well, there's a nice base level for you. Renita didn't touch the floor, which is nice. That's a little bit like my girlfriend just did that for me in front of me. So that's cool. If that was the case, we would find a way of being able to progress it. Generally, people who have had a ankle injury or period of non-weight bearing, they will find that as a challenging task, but most people will find that challenging anyway. But what we're going to do now is we're going to layer on a dual task on top of that now. So now you have the choice. You could either do the same leg or you can do the opposite leg. Either way, there's going to be a bit of a there's going to be a limitation in direct interpretation, because there's going to be a learning effect if you do it on the same leg, and it's going to be a different leg if you do it on the other leg. However, this is application of this research, which shows that if done in terms of practice over time, you will drive the balance more automatic and subconscious. So you're going to do the same task now, your choice, of the same leg, which has maybe got a little bit of a burn and tired. But when I program this, I would do 2-3 sets at the end of a session. And you're going to start at a random number above 100, okay? And then you're going to count down in sevens. Very, very, very famous Gabrielle Wolf cognitive task. Seven is an awkward number, so it always lands in a different. You don't get it if you're going down in tens. You get into a rhythm. Sevens, you've constantly got to be able to be thinking about it, which is why it's a very effective use for these cognitive layering tasks. And you could do that start at a different number. So start at 106, maybe start at 101, whatever. Then in your 60-second set, I want you to try and count down to 0 in sevens. Okay, same thing. See if that has any change on the experience for you. It may or may not. It definitely will if you apply this over time. Okay, so your second set, same task, your choice of side, 50 bounces for an element of pre-fatiguing, and then sevens into your eyes closed 60-second set. Clock starts now. Huh? Girlfriend's next to be farting.
I lost count.
Okay. Can't take loud. What are you starting on?
101. And then 100, and I'm really bad at 106, about 4. 100 and
Count backwards.
yeah, I'm trying. Oh, 94. Oh, I'm so bad at mental maths. 104, 100, 94, 80.
Tell you some of your balance looks rock solid.
It's my math. It's my math I can do.
Yeah, but look how much thought process it's taken.
I'm only on the second one. So 94, 86. No. 8, 4.
There you are, that's your minute.
6.
Any floor touches?
No.
Perfect.
Horrible.
Cool. Cool. Well, we just had a little bit of a laugh here as Callie couldn't count backwards in sevens, but as a result of the difficulty of doing that, she didn't touch the floor at all, which is kind of the point. Because if you just rattled down there in sevens, I'd have said, right, go down or go to the alphabet backwards, or spell your family members' names backwards. Any cognitive task that means that you have to be consciously thinking about it, which drives the secondary task of the balance to just happen. So a useful little experience for you there to be able to apply. There's some videos that we use here to be able to increase the intensity of the balance task there. So, you know, maybe we make some constraints. I think I've shared this with you at a couple of points in class, where the balance task, then I would, you know, when you're with your eyes closed, I would give you a little push. You've got to keep your eyes closed, and then you've got to land and stick the landing without hopping and jumping around, keeping your eyes closed the whole time. And I could push you in different directions depending on the intensity of how I want to push the balance task along where you are in the rehab process and how successful you are. If someone's coming in, I think it was Renita said, or Despina, Alexandra, whichever one said they didn't touch the floor. You know, I would find a way there of then progressing on that task so that it was getting that level of engagement, little pushes or stick dodges or hand dodges or ball catches or something that would have then changed the task. Videos there of me and Paul applying that, but hopefully something useful for you to take from that in this idea of dual task training for being able to better represent the time frame that injurious running injuries happen. Representative design for lifting something. Again, if we bring this into, remember the grandfather task where he had to, one of their goals was to be able to lift the grandchild. You know, this is a lift it task that I'll use in application of heavier load. Once we get to the point, a bit like Harrison or Mr. Wheel at the start there, where hurt doesn't equal harm. We've identified sensitizing factors, and then we're grading exposures towards meaningful end goals. You know, instead of getting on the track as it did with him with his cycling, maybe it is the task of picking up heavy objects. This is taken or inspired from Strongman, as I think when you tie that to envelope of function and the relevance of this for everyday life, being able to set tasks where people can pick things up in different ways, maybe to different heights, for different time frames, useful for building up that physical resilience, but probably as much as anything, the psychological confidence and resilience to be able to meet the demands of what they're saying they want to be able to get to do. to lift up their granddaughter, to be able to get back to moving patio slabs at home, to be able to work down low as a builder, whatever it may be. So that I wanted to be able to share with you as an idea for heavy loading application of this non-linear prescription. Still some guidance on programming there that I'd jot down if I was you guys, because that becomes a bit of a framework that you might use going into a session and then change it based on the response of the person. But going into that, you want them to be at the point that hurt and harm are not one and the same, that we can dial pain up and dial pain down, and that our loading exposure needs to be slow and graded. Those would be prerequisites before going into something like this. Probably what we'll spend the remaining 20 minutes, which I think is very relevant for us as healthcare professionals. It's becoming more relevant for us as healthcare professionals as the research is driving us to be bringing in elements of coaching and pedagogy into practice, which is the attention that we have when doing a movement or a task. And an external focus of attention has been described as where the performer's action is directed toward the effect of the action, whereas an internal focus of attention is where your attention is directed at the action itself. Okay, so external focus, you're outcome oriented. Internal focus, you're process oriented. You're thinking about what is causing the movement. Is one superior to the other, and is there a place for both? And that's where I want to be able to share. I mentioned Gabrielle Wolf there before with the Sevens task. This is the research that potentially gives the most weight to external focuses of attention being superior to internal focus of attention, especially when it comes to skill acquisition. So in this task, the goal was to be able to pitch a football up to a target. Okay, it's not particularly far away, but there was a lofting task to be able to hit the target. So we have a direct outcome of a direct measure of success as to whether you hit the target or not. And then there was a couple of different couple of different scenarios that they used to be able to see, was there a difference in whether you gave someone an external focus of attention or an internal focus of attention, and also how often you gave those cues. So internal focus feedback from the coach that would be in the research would be, again, talking about the process. So example would be position your foot below the ball's midline to lift the ball. Position your body weight and the non-kicking foot behind the ball. Lock your ankle down and use the instep to strike the ball. All internal language to try and guide the movement of hitting the target. Compare that to external focus, which would be, for example, be behind the ball, not over it, and lean back. Stroke the ball towards the target as if passing to another player. Use a long lever type action, so a bit of imagery there, like the swing of a golf club before contact with the ball. So there's the two different situations, one external and one internal. And what they also did was give them either of those, either every time or just a third of the time. So 100% of the time they would have internal or external feedback or cueing, or a third of the time, or 33% of the time. And that's what we can see on this graph here, is that we have external cueing 100% of the time, external cueing 33% of the time, internal cueing 33% of the time, internal cueing 100% of the time. And the number of accuracy here is so clear that the people who had an external cue, so these square lines, did significantly better. If you had an external cue 100% of the time, they did a little bit better than if you had an external cue 33% of the time. And these two lines down here were the internal cueing. So giving people this internal language to try and hit the target gave people significantly less success when it comes to the lofting task. And what's possibly the most pertinent takeaway for me on here is that if you had a internal cueing 100% of the time, so this solid black line here, you did worse than if you had internal cueing just a third of the time. So a case for dose response. The more internal language you use, the less someone does. So this is where what the title is about here, is being able to say the most with the least. I think over coaching and over cueing is a big problem. Being able to try and solve everything for someone gets in the way of self-organization and letting people be able to find a way. You know, if we're all doing this football lofted task, we've all got different length shins, we've all got different experience with hitting a football, we've all got different foot size. So trying to cue internal language intuitively won't be this as effective as focusing on just hitting the underside of the ball and guiding it towards the target, or any of these external cues. And that's what they found. Retention test at the end there is, okay, so you have a break for a period of days or weeks, and then you come back and you give people no information and you just do the task again and see what happens. And that's what, again, the external cues, the group who had external cue in the training did significantly better, and still those who had internal did significantly worse. Internal 100% of the time worse. So this is probably one of the most landmark research that illustrates the superiority of external cueing for skill acquisition. Dan, elaborate on your question there for me, mate. Dan, which part do you mean? Why is external cueing superior to internal cueing?
Yeah, sorry, my computer was being a bit slow for turning the mic on. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I was asking. How come it's got such a dramatic effect that it almost like doubles their score? Like,
yeah.
Why is it so effective?
I think that's a great question, and I think that by the end of this session, or the next few slides, I think I sort of guide towards hopefully answering your question, because this isn't just the case. We don't see this just in skill acquisition. If I roll this on here, we see this in strength and force production also. We see, so this is a deadlift task where, just pop your mic on silent for a second, Dan.
Yep.
You know, if we go into a deadlift task, which is people are given external cues where you're to focus on pushing the ground as hard and fast away as you can, or an internal cue of contract your legs as hard and fast as you can, people lift 9% versus 5% on the external cue. People lift more, produce more force when given an external cue. We see it in jumping literature as well, where people are given a standing broad jump and an internal cue of extend your knees as rapidly as you can, or an external cue of jump as far past the start line as possible, and we see a 10 centimeter difference in how much force someone can produce. Also in speed, in a 10-yard dash, if you give people cueing on focus on driving your legs back as explosively as you can, versus external, where you focus on driving the ground back as explosively as you can, people who had the internal cueing run slower. Sounds like not much here, 2.14 to 2.16, but when you're talking about the time frames of a 10-second dash, that is a relevant difference. So it's in skill acquisition, we see a clear superiority on external focus of attention. In power and force production, we see it. In strength, we see it. In speed and agility, we see it. And I'd like, again, if we had a bit more time here, if we were in class, I'd get you guys to try this out yourself. This is I've married up that Porter research with a power test from parkour, which is basically free running, to be able to take a measure of your overhead body length, which is, as I'm showing you how to do this here, from the tips of your toes to your fingertips, and then be able to do a standing broad jump, that length, where your toes are behind the line to start with, and then your heels clear your overhead body length. That's just a bit of a baseline measure for parkour, and you'll probably be a bit surprised how challenging that is, because it's obviously relevant to your size. But try it with a couple of conditions. Try it where you do it with the internal focus of attention, where you're focusing on squeezing your legs as explosively as you can, or try the external focus of attention, where you're thinking about, in my example, they're jumping to the fence or jumping as far past the start line as you can, and see if that has any difference for you. You know, when we look at the research, it does consistently outperform when we focus externally. So Bernstein back in the 60s talks about coordination control being delegated to subordinate levels of the central nervous system. This is where movement control is less conscious, and that's where I think the answer to what you're suggesting, to your question there, Daniel, is that when our attention of movement is internal, it's conscious. My focus is on my legs. My focus is on my focus is on my glutes. The focus is on the movement as opposed to being on the outcome of the movement. So in internal focus of attention, we're probably getting in the way of self-organization, where we want to be outcome oriented, which seems to be able to, we find a way that is best for the person. So a bit like in that soccer football task there, if I try to get you to be able to achieve success on that task the same as me, but you've got a size 3 foot versus my size 11, you're 5'2" versus I'm 6'2", you have never played football before, I've played football before, and I try and cue you with internally trying to replicate and copy me, probably not going to support you finding a way to solve it the way that your body is best going to solve it. Daniel?
You just kind of used what I was about to say when you were saying play football before and not play football before, because surely there becomes a point due to experience where those external cues kind of lose their efficacy, because eventually the skills become sort of natural, where to a point where you don't have to think about them. Say if you were comparing a professional footballer, or if you were comparing yourself deadlifting, surely there's a point when it becomes subconscious anyway when you get to a certain level of skill, so it kind of loses its use over internal cues.
Well, we've got some research to be able to look at exactly that, because I think what would probably happen is the more we go towards an experienced performer in that task, probably the more important it becomes. And we see that in golfing studies, where if we give people who are expert golfers time constraints, so you're an expert golfer, Dan, and you're only going to have 3 seconds to be able to get yourself onto the ball and play this shot. Expert golfers do better when they have a time constraint, and that's been alluded. The reason behind that is because it stops people thinking too much. It gets people straight into the flow of the outcome. Do that to novices, give them time constraints, and they do worse. So this is an example where if we are taking a novice who doesn't have any experience with the task, then maybe internal language and communication becomes important for familiarity and building the prerequisites for what we then want to make automatic. Because once we can then practice the skill and get it to the point where we can then be outcome measured, focusing outcome becomes far more important as we become better at the task. So I'd say it's probably the complete opposite to what you initially suggested, but hopefully this research here sort of suggests an idea of moving from an internal focus of attention and grading towards external. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because for me, I'd relate it to tennis, and when I get an easy shot flying up in the air that's slow, it's harder to hit than when you have no time.
Yeah. So that sort of marries up with the literature on novices and time and internal and external focus. Now, what does injury do or pain do to our focus of attention? Because intuitively, if I've got pain in my wrist or I've got an injury to my wrist, my attention is going to be drawn to my wrist. So intuitively, it seems that injury causes an internal focus of attention, and that has that been studied? And that's what this Rob Gray research did, because they wanted to know, does that happen, and at some point does that unhappen? Because from a performance perspective or a rehabilitation perspective, we want to get people back to being able to do whatever they want to be able to do. So if they're going to be still thinking about their injury or their pain, then that's not going to be well aligned with return to optimal performance. So what they did here is they found a group of pitchers, or Rob Gray used a group of baseball hitters who had had knee injury in the past or knee pain in the past, and they're back playing. So they're discharged from rehab, they're back playing baseball. And what they did is they put them into a simulation study. It's a clever design. So it's not exactly representative of the environment, but these simulators, again, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Black Mirror or augmented reality. I think in the future is going to be very close to indistinguishable from reality, and I think that is going to become virtual reality, etc., is going to be an important part of coming into rehab. But this is what they used on. They used a simulator study where the batters would be hitting the ball that was a virtual ball, and at the point of contact there would be a little sound, and there would be a little sound that wasn't loud enough to stop them swinging, but it was loud enough for them to hear. And over repeated trials, they would ask the batter about where the ball was, so moving left to right, moving up or down, where their arm was, or where their knee was. Because if you do that enough times, at the point of ball contact, you can see where someone's focus of attention is. It's a clever study, really, really clever. And what this showed was, again, I can't remember if I said there, but they had expert hitters who had knee injury in the past, but then they also had expert hitters who hadn't had knee injury in the past. So that's this white block here, and the black block is the people who had knee injury in the past. Now, the first bit of evidence that people's focus of attention is not where it should be after knee injury is the accuracy about where the ball was at ball contact. The people who had not had a knee injury in the past were significantly more accurate at knowing where the ball was at ball contact than the people who had a previous history of knee pain or injury. So there's the first bit of evidence that people's attention after injury is not where we might want it to be, because again, if you want to be successful on hitting the ball, you probably want to be focusing on the ball. And this is then supported by the middle graph here, which shows that the people who had a history of knee injury, they were far more accurate at knowing where their leg was at contact with the ball, versus those who had not had knee injury in the past were far less accurate. So really nice research to show that injury drives an internal focus of attention, and even way after rehab, people's focus of attention has not been returned to getting outside of their body and back into the environment. And then you marry that up with what language are healthcare professionals using, because this is super important. This is physios, but I think this would be extrapolatable to, if that's even a word, to chiropractors and other allied healthcare professionals, where this is from stroke rehab, where physical therapists are using internal language 67% of the time versus 22%. So people are trying to return hand function, and they're talking about internal language. Extend your wrist, lift your finger, rather than being outcome oriented. So you want to be able to write again. Let's get hold of the pen and let's get focused on the lines of the writing. Is that a mutually exclusive finding in rehab? No, we see it in track and field as well. So 85% of strength coaches are using internal language as well to be able to drive, lift your knees high, contract your abs, set your glutes, squeeze, all of these internal language of communication, even though the research is so overwhelmingly clear that if we can get external focus, that people perform better on force production, on skill acquisition, on speed, and they retain it better as well. So really important, and a big support for this idea of rehabilitation being about structuring a pathway that moves people to thoughtless, fearless, relaxed movement. We want people going back to, I want my gentleman at the start there to be going back to riding and going downhill on the bike, and his attention has to be on the task. It cannot be that his attention is on his back while he's going over those jumps. And it's my job to create the tasks and to be able to use my language to facilitate that process, being aware of this research. This is a funny little thing that was taken from the Harlem Globetrotters, again, a little bit like we talked saying with the golf study, or with Daniel's tennis example there, was how changing your focus of attention is the basis of choking. And this is, you'll see this in performers on big occasions, and this is, you've got a big kick at goal to win the game in rugby, or you've got a penalty at the end of a penalty shootout in football. Being able to keep process oriented is absolutely fundamental. This chap, Harold Levitt, was a little player in the Harlem Globetrotters, used to get fouled a lot because he was small, so he practiced free throws, and in the world record attempt did 499 in a row and missed the 500th. His interview then talked about how he choked, and that's a classic example. He'd have been just in a rhythm, focused on the outcome for 499. All of a sudden it gets to the 500th, and he'd have been starting to think about his elbow position, or thinking about where he's looking, or something would have changed. And I know this, if I just play snooker, or if I play something where I'm all of a sudden I'm on a losing streak and I just cannot hit a barn door with a banjo, all of a sudden I'm thinking, am I looking at the cue? Am I looking at the white ball? Am I looking at the target ball? There is a shift in us becoming focused internally rather than outcome on externally. And if you're playing tennis, Daniel, and you want to break your opponent down, ask them to explain how they did it. That's one way to get a person to focus internally and fuck them up. Do with that what you wish, but try to not let it happen to you. So that's what I wanted to be able to share with you guys today, and seeing, I can run on for a couple of minutes because there'd be a nice end to this in a couple of slides. Daniel, do you jump on?
I know this is probably going more into the realms of sports psychology, but say you were then in that situation where you were coaching that sports professional to achieve that task, be it hit that 500th basket or whatever. What would you say to them then to try and make them focus more externally rather than internally? Because obviously when you doubt yourself, it is more natural to think internally.
Yeah, 100%. And I can relate to that, being a sport performer in many capacities. And one of the things that I'm most connected was, I used to be the goal kicker when I used to play rugby. So, when you're kicking that goal and you have your processes, which is about a bit like that lofting task in the football there. So, finding, and your practice is about finding the outcome and focuses of attention that work for you. So whether it is about I used to picture when I was playing kicking rugby, I used to picture the post, and then I used to picture something between the posts. If I was playing in a stadium, it used to be that I would picture someone that sat in between the posts and that they are holding an ice cream. That was something that I learned with Johnny Hooks. I used to train, as I said, I used to be coached by Neil Jenkins, who was the world record point scorer, and being able to be finding that outcome focus of attention that you can drown out with whatever the scenario, so that you keep that levels of human psychology and the occasion from making you focus internally. Because what happens when you choke is all of a sudden you forget, you're thinking about, right, I've been practicing this is how I focus, find that woman in the crowd, find that ice cream, be able to get my breath, go through my processes. All of a sudden you find yourself, right, I need to make sure I need to make sure I'm stepping in the right place. Or all of a sudden you start freezing and you start losing your process outcome focus. So if you're working with someone, I'm not a sports psychologist, but this is interesting. This is interesting for me, as I hope it might be for some of you. But it would be around treating that 500th as the same as any 499th before it, and just getting into that rhythm to the point where you don't let that situation of the 500th become a factor at all. And that's difficult, because that's where the best performers in the world are able to do that. Other people, they start focusing internally, and the situation takes their focus off the outcome. So that's using internal. Is there a place for internal cueing though? And that's what this research was really. useful by Keith Lose, was a calf raise task where they wanted to be able to do it was a calf raise, and they did EMG trackers to be able to put on all the muscles to see what the activity of them was during the task. And they either give them the external cue of press the floor away as hard as you can, or contract your calves as hard as you can. And in this external one on the left here, we can see the tibialis anterior, which is the antagonist to a calf raise, the opposite to what you would want. And when you focus externally, it is completely silent, which again makes sense, because otherwise that would be like a handbrake to you being able to produce an effective optimal calf raise. Give someone an internal cue to squeeze your calf as hard as you can, and the tibialis anterior on the calf raise is much more active. And we see that across these different participants here. So, I mean, is there a place for that? Well, very early stage rehab where maybe maximal contraction without movement is what you want. So isometrics in your tendinopathy work, or in your early load introduction in back rehab, maybe do some static holds or whatever it may be a place for that. Or even bodybuilding, you know, if maybe that is literally peak contraction that you're looking for, and even being able to focus intensely on that, using that mind-muscle connection, as Arnold Schwarzenegger made famous. You know, there's a place for that there. So internal cueing there is a place for it. It seems to be helpful for novices to learn, maybe in bodybuilding, maybe in really early stage rehab, but maybe seeing it as a continuum to progress towards self-organization is the goal. And that's what I think. You know, I'm conscious that we're running over time here now, but there's a few of you still on, so this is the last time I'm going to potentially see some of you ever again. So we'll take this moment. You can jump off if you want, but this is bollocks. Is that not going to let me move that? I had a series that's I'm just going to kick me out there. I've hidden those, because if I was doing this as a task, what we do in our CPD is we take a series of tasks and get you to come up with internal focus attention and external. So shooting a basketball, internal focus would be focusing on wrist flexion, and external focus attention would be focusing on ball rotation, all the way through to lots of examples, like if you're focusing on hopping, focusing, you know, an internal focus attention would be to be able to squeeze your calves. A external focus attention would be short ground contact times, as an example, and a series all the way through of different ones. And before I finish, you know, what I wanted to, you know, that lecture that I played, that video I played at the start of last lecture, which was the Stalin memorization, which is the self-organization of chaotic systems. External cues seem to facilitate self-organization by getting our consciousness out of the way, which I think answers Dan's question around why does it seem to outperform on all of these tasks, because I think it harnesses self-organization for the person superior to internal focus of attention. And being able to use analogy and metaphor is like an extension of an external cue. So being able to cue it, being able to understand that your thoughts literally become your movements, because if you think about your knee being like a rusty hinge, then the movements that is going to embody will be of a rusty hinge, versus if we're using language like motion is lotion, or storms make trees grow deeper roots, and you know, the Explain Pain Supercharged has loads of stuff on this, but being able to use imagery for being able to power movements is super effective. This is what Nick Wilkerman uses, a few different types of scenarios. So being able to imagine if you're trying to sprint, then try and take off like an aeroplane. Move as if. Imagine there's a pane of glass in front of you and you're trying to smash that with each stride. Imagine that you are running up a sand dune, and this is just all to do with taking off and sprinting to try and facilitate self-organization. They did research where rather than cue people to have a high knee drive or powerful elbow drive, that simply putting green tape on those landmarks and cueing, move the green tape as fast as you can, outperformed internal language focus of attention, again because it supports self-organization. Maybe there's clinical reason in there for some kinesio tape. I think I'll leave that there. and hopefully some food for thought for you. I'll upload this video to this session to Blackboard so you can review it, as well as all the slides that I haven't been able to get to. But I hope it's helpful, and anything that you guys would want helpful, then send me an email if I can help. Otherwise, good luck in whichever way you guys go from this point, and maybe I'll see you guys in the future on a CPD or on an internship in some capacity. Thanks very much for participation in these sessions, and take care. See you or not.